RAB meeting for May 9th, 2023. First is the meeting minutes. Is there any additions or corrections for the minutes from last week? No? Okay, could I get a motion to approve?
I will motion to approve the minutes from March 20th. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so on the old business, we was gonna discuss the meeting frequency again. We have the options of monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly, and they can be changed basically at any time. If more information comes in, there's more to go over, then at that time we can change the frequency to monthly if we need to, bi-monthly or quarterly. So does anybody have any suggestions on the frequency of the meetings?
I would propose that we consider changing the frequency to a little longer than monthly, just because there's not that much to report on a monthly basis for us at the board. And it would help us if we had a little more time to present more information to you, say on a bi-monthly basis or quarterly basis. We are in the process of preparing a fact sheet. That fact sheet can be provided, for example, if we meet on a quarterly basis, we could provide a fact sheet more frequently, just to keep everybody informed. But have these meetings, which take a lot of time on everybody's part to meet and for us to put presentations together. And so I would suggest that maybe we meet quarterly. If there's a need and a lot is happening, we can definitely change and meet more frequently. But at this point in time, there doesn't seem to be that much to report on that it would warrant meeting every month, at least from the Army Corps' perspective. I open the floor to further discussion.
If we could just back up for a moment and do the roll call, and then we'll continue back in.
Okay. So please respond if you hear your name called. Myself, Chris Bai, is the USACE co-chair in the future. Megan, what's Megan's last name? Garrett will be sitting in as co-chair in the future as the PM for the project. So present, Glenn Bell.
Yes.
Present. Chrissy Baptiste. She's online and she is. Do we have sound from online? Yes, they should be able to.
Yes, I'm here. This is Chrissy Baptiste.
Okay. Jordan Bennett. Here. Jerry Eagle. We'll talk about Mr. Eagle in a moment. Tracy Frank. Jesse Groves.
Yes, Groves is here.
Thank you, Jesse. Carl Merkel.
I'm here.
Kate Murphy. Present. And Andrea Sumero.
Here.
Okay, that's the RAB, present and accounted for. Perhaps before we move on, we do have a number of people in the room who might want to know who's in the room. So why don't we go around and introduce ourselves so everyone knows who's here. And we'll start back in that corner, John, with you.
Hi, how are you? So that we can see you. I'm John Morgan. I'm a public affairs specialist with Corps of Engineers. Thank you. Hi, Eric Strickland, Chief Project Management Branch for Portland District Court.
Hi, I'm Megan Garrix. I'm the Army Corps Project Manager. Jackie Frazier, Program Manager for Bradford Island and Kansas City. Linda Balcom, Environmental Consultant to Bradford Island. I'm Katie Roberts. I'm part of this team to help you facilitate your future RAB meetings.
Should I go?
Can if you'd like.
Okay, I am Kate Murphy, Community Organizer with Columbia. Bill Gardner, I'm a risk assessor and toxicologist in the Seattle district, supporting Portland.
Heidi Nelson, I'm with Oregon DEQ Purity Project.
Good evening, Jeff Matson, Portland District Office of Counsel, available if anyone has any legal questions.
Rich Francis, EPA Remedial Project Manager for Bradford Island.
And folks online, other than the RAB members we've already introduced, care to introduce yourself?
Sure. You, so I think,
We'll have Katie just rattle off the names.
okay, really quickly, so Autumn, if you see her, she is, she works for my company, Monomecker and Associates. She is part of Linda's team, facilitating the virtual portion of the RAB meeting tonight. Let's see, we've gone through the board members. Let's see, I see Lydia Anderson, Amanda Krantz, Christina Donhauer, Jay Shaw, Laura Shira, Mike Olson, Tina Horton, Julie, and my apologies if I absolutely massacre your last name, Rogel, I believe, Laura Knudsen, Paula Calvert, and Dana Crosby. Thank you for attending this evening.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Okay, back to business.
Okay, back to the old business, the meeting frequency. What, is there any suggestions? Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Kate Murphy with Columbia River Keeper. I think that given the urgency of the public health risk that's there daily, and given that we're a year into it, and this is one of the only ways for us to get updates and then pass those on to the public, I would like to put in a vote for continuing the monthly meetings, and if at some point they seem to become repetitive or not useful, certainly open to revisiting. But I think, yeah, it's just, we risk losing a lot of time if we're only having 4 meetings per year, and we're already this far past, we're 1 year in and still waiting on timeline.
And we do still have the option of every 2 months and the bi-monthly. That's an option as well. Anybody else?
Jordan Bennett with the city of Cascade Locks. I am kind of in agreement with Katie, right?
Yeah.
And we're all new to this, at least the board members. I'm new to this process and kind of really learning what our role is. I think for now, maybe monthly, till we kind of get our feet under us and we know what we're doing, what we're really looking for in these meetings is a good idea. And I'm really hoping to actually learn what I'm supposed to be doing today.
Okay, so we'll stay with the monthly meetings.
Sounds like, and that was voted on last meeting, right? Go.
Yes, it was.
So no change there. Okay, the other old business, at the last meeting, there was a mention of additional fish advisory signage that the Corps was going to put in place. They were coordinating with the Oregon Health Authority to get some visual products from them we can incorporate in that signage. And my understanding is we are waiting on Oregon Health Authority to provide that, those products to us so we can incorporate that, get those signs up. John, is that?
That's correct.
Yeah. So that's the update on the signage. We're still trying to get the information we need to put that additional signage up. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the new business.
Okay, so with the new business, we got a letter of resignation submitted from Jerry Big Eagle from the Cowlitz tribe. He had suggested that we try to get another member from the Cowlitz tribe. So unless we have a name, we can move forward, but still see if we can find somebody from the Cowlitz tribe to fill that position, just so we can continue to move forward. I think we should try that before we just delete that position on the board. We should try to fill it with somebody from the tribe.
maybe my memory's off, didn't we talk about going back to the original list of applicants last meeting or no?
I believe everybody that applied was put on the ground,
Okay,
so we
all right.
don't have a waiting list.
Okay, well, never mind then.
But in Mr. Bigel's resignation letter, he did express a desire that someone else from the tribe backfill for him, but he didn't have a recommendation. I can reach out to him again and see if he can put us in touch with someone. But his thinking was it'd be good to have some Cowles on the RAB. And the composition of the RAB is it's targeted at certain groups in the community, business folks, the tribal members and so forth. And so we would like to replace in kind a tribal member with another tribal member. It doesn't necessarily have to be Cowles, it could be from another tribe, but we would like to maintain that balance on the RAB committee of that composition from different areas of the community. So I think the plan would be then to reach out to Cowles and see if there's someone else from the tribe that would like to participate in the RAB. And if not, then we would need to probably publicly advertise the position and let the other tribes know that there's a tribal position open on the RAB and see if we get any interest. So that's the process we will follow, if that's okay with you.
So, can I get a motion to move forward, with the RAB board while we're awaiting the member?
The back. So we would be proceeding shy of that one member. Is everybody okay with that? That's the motion. So I'm okay with that. Do you second the motion, or do we second the motion and then vote on it?
Yes.
Yes. So I'll second the motion, and then we should probably go around the horn and vote. Is that how you guys did it last time? All those opposed, say yay.
I remember what we did. Was it
Yay.
Everybody's, anybody opposed? Speak now. Okay, so motion was passed. Okay, and then the administrative record. And for this update, I would like to ask Mr. John Morgan to update the group on the latest development in our admin record, which is now available at the Stevenson Library.
And thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the administrative record. A couple of purposes behind the administrative records. For one, we need to abide by the law. The law requires us to have this administrative record. The other purpose is to provide some transparency to everybody in the public to see what is doing, what we've done, where we've come from. And as we develop products and facts and do the studies, we will make them publicly available online and also at the Stevenson Library. Stevenson Library has been great, is offered to host the actual physical location for these records. So if anybody's interested in needing to see these documents publicly or on hand, they will be able to provide that. Additionally, you can see the resources here. You can go online and check out the administrative record online. The digital library, our USACE digital library, is a great resource. Currently, we have over 100 documents, plus 100 plus documents for the administrative records. So if you're looking and thinking about, hey, it's part of the RAB and what you need to know, I encourage you to visit, our administrative record to kind of look through, the past and look through the history. So this is available to us. Here's a location where you can find, the actual physical repository and where it is available to us online. So thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Can everybody online see the slide with the information, the link and the address for the library?
Yes.
Okay,
Then
great.
thumbs up.
Great, thumbs up. Good. Thank you, John. Okay, so next on the agenda is a update from our project staff on where we are on the project and what to be looking for in the future. Keeping in mind that the purpose of this RAB is to inform the public of progress on the project and solicit feedback and comments on products as they're produced as we go through the circular process. So today we have an a risk assessor from our Seattle district named Bill Gardner, who is going to update us on the project status. Bill?
Actually, well, you won't be able to see it on the screen if you point to it.
Okay, I'll try to describe.
It's lost,
If I have one. Thanks for coming this evening. So what I was asked to do is to provide an overview of some of the work that we have upcoming at the site. And then to talk a little bit about some of the data collection efforts that have occurred since the RI came out in 2016. So what is the technical work that we've been doing on the site since the RI came out? So that's what we'll do today. In this presentation, I'll talk about the different kinds of data collection efforts that we've been undergoing. It'll be a fairly high-level presentation, maybe mid-level. And then if there's a particular topic that people want to know, get into more depth with and know more about, we can maybe at a future RAB meeting talk a little bit about more the information that has been gathered during these surveys. We can go to the next thing. So the thing on the top.
I'll do my best.
So the first thing is to talk about some upcoming work that we have in the river operable unit. The river operable unit is.
We don't want to leave the meeting, no.
Sorry, you might be able to just grab it and like drag it to the side, the black strip.
And I was trying, and I believe that I was trying to leave the meeting as a result, sorry.
Is the mouse?
The computer is challenging.
Well, I'll
You can't see that in the virtual, so.
okay. So right now we're planning on doing some investigations in the river operable unit. This is the area upstream of the dam up to the upriver extent of Goose Island. And this will help to address some of the data gaps that we have in the river in understanding the contamination there, the nature and extent, and the nature of that contamination in the riverbed. This will help to support the feasibility study and in developing the different remedial alternatives for the site. We have been working with EPA, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and Washington Department of Ecology in trying to identify what data gaps exist after the RI, what we still have to understand out there. And so the types of things that we'll focus on are sediment sampling to refine the nature and extent of contamination. I'll talk about each of these in more detail. Sediment sampling to try to find what we call non-aqueous phase liquid, NAPL, PCBs. These are PCBs in the oil form, so they're denser than water and they tend to sink to the bottom and get into the cracks and crevices on the river bottom. Soil sampling in Goose Island, sediment sampling near the mouth of Eagle Creek and in the forebay, and then also current measurements and sediment deposition studies to better understand sediment transport characteristics around the site. So I'll talk about each of these in the next few slides. So go to the next slide. So our understanding of the contamination in the riverbed based on the RI includes much of the forebay, certainly the Oregon shore, the shorelines around Goose Island, south side of Bradford Island, Cascade Island, and then the north side of Bradford Island, North Shore and the eastern tip. And that, based on the information that we have, is definitely our hotter spot. That's where the PCB concentrations are highest in the sediments, in the tissues that we've sampled. And so that is kind of what we consider to be our source area and the area of most concern, and more likely where we'll have remediation. However, the sampling that was done during the RI didn't extend far enough away from shore to bound the contamination. So we don't know where the edge of that contamination is at this point in time. So part of what we'll try to do is to develop a sampling plan to go get information information for the sediments in the bed that's further away from the shoreline. So out beyond that blue line that's on the bathymetry map. So that light blue line that's on the bathymetry, I think you can tell that gradually slopes downward to the forebay. The bottom of the forebay is the blue area. I'm looking at the right-hand picture that has the bathymetry on it. So that deeper area is the forebay, and then it slopes up towards Bradford Island. And that light blue line that's kind of hand drawn is the extent of our sampling. So we need to go further out to try to map the sampling. And just so you understand, the middle image, when it's darker blue, those are the highest concentrations of PCBs in the sediments. The medium blues are the medium concentrations, and then the light blues are the lowest concentrations. The other thing is that the existing data that we have is all for surface samples. And so that's probably the upper 6 inches of sediment. And what we don't have a good understanding of is how deep to the sediment bed the contamination goes. And so we'll try to collect samples that help us understand the vertical extent of contamination in the riverbed. One of the challenges of this site is that the substrate it's quite varied. And so you do have some areas that are what you might think of when you think of sediment, so they're sandy areas. Certainly along the south side of Bradford Island, it's very sandy. But on the North Shore, where we have the most contamination, it's very rocky. There's a lot of boulder, cobble, gravel. And then when there is sandy sediment, it tends to be more transient. So it settles during part of the year and then moves off the rest of the year. And so that's not the sediment we're looking for when we're trying to figure out where's the contamination that was from a source 50 years ago. We're trying to find that stuff that's more stable and more resident to the site. So we're going to try to get samples deeper into the sediment bed. Unfortunately, the tools that we usually use, like a cord that you would put into the bottom, core tube that you would put into the bottom and then pull a column of sediment out, aren't really available to us because of the nature of the bottom. So we're just going to have to get a little more clever, and some of that sampling is slow and expensive, but if we're strategic about where we put the samples, hopefully we can learn more about the vertical extent of contamination. Yeah, and then the potential for contamination to extend downslope, that's part of this, understanding the extent away from the North Shore. It does slope down all the way to the forebay, and so the nature of our contamination source was materials that were disposed of in the river, and so we just need to make sure that things didn't move downhill when they were removed. So that's the nature extent part of the work that we're going to be doing, hopefully starting in the fall next year. One of the things just to be aware of when we talk about our work is that the area in front of North Shore Bradford Island is a restricted area because of the spillway. And so when the spillway is open, water is flowing through that spillway, we're not allowed to work in that area. And so we have 6 months essentially, and that spillway is closed and the work area is open. So we'll wait until September until our venue is open. Next slide. One of the things I spoke about was trying to find the non-aqueous phase liquids, the NAPL. This is like oil that was in the electrical equipment that was put in the river. And we know that and the oils leaked out of it. And that's our primary source that we believe is the cause of the PCB contamination at the site, at least the primary source. And yet we have never really been able to find NAPL. It's partly because of the nature of the bottom, the river bottom at the site. So lots of cracks and crevices, and it's hard to get down in there to find these PCB oils. And so we do have, there is some methods called sonic coring, which is a slow process to drive a core through all of that material. And so we'll probably be collecting samples in that way at very strategic locations. By finding the NAPL, it will help us to design the remedy, help us to understand whether or not we have this mobile phase that could move through a regular cap. Maybe we could use a different kind of cap to engineer the solution for the riverbed. So that's part of what we'll also be doing. That will probably be later in the stage because it's such a resource intensive process. We probably want to collect all the information we can to try to find the best spots to go to. And we're working on this with EPA in the States to try to come up with a strategy that will work here. Next slide. So there are some other areas that were underrepresented by the initial sampling. 3 in particular that we're going to be trying to collect data from. In the upper left-hand corner, that is that bathymetry map again, and the blue area is what we call the forebay pool, or at least it's the biggest portion of the forebay pool. And one characteristic of dams is that when sediment moves downriver and it runs into a structure like a dam, it tends to settle out. And so one of the things that we need to understand is whether or not contaminated sediment from the site has ended up and deposited in that forebay area. So we'll try to address that during this sampling. A complication can be the contamination from our site may have mixed from things that are coming down the river and have settled there as well, but that's just something we'll have to work through as we look at the data. The upper right-hand side of the 3 images there, that's Goose Island. Goose Island was actually created when they made the channel for the new nav lock. And so when they were doing that, they had to take off a portion of the eastern tip of Bradford Island. They shaved that off and some of the subtidal areas that are right in front of it, and they moved that over and created Goose Island. It's basically, there's a perimeter, I believe, of riprap and material that's put inside of that. Because the landfill is on the eastern tip of Bradford Island, we might expect that there's contamination in that material. So we're going to go collect soil samples from Goose Island. That's part of this evaluation. And then finally, the bottom right-hand photo is Eagle Creek, where it comes into the Columbia River. And at the mouth of Eagle Creek, in the black and white photo, you can see there's a little red dot there. And that is this one sample that has a slightly elevated, well, has an elevated PCB concentration. Not as high as what we see on the north side of Bradford Island, but definitely higher than everything around it, which is background, I would say, or at least background for this area. And so we're going to try to take some samples in Eagle Creek as well as upriver towards Goose Island to try to understand where that may be coming from. Let's see, go to the next slide. So the other thing that that's helpful for us to understand as we go through the end of the remedial investigation phase and into the feasibility study phase and developing our remedial alternatives is understanding how sediment moves at the site and how contamination and contaminated sediments might move at the site. So we do this by looking at the currents and the current speeds, particularly right at the riverbed floor, and that helps us understand whether the currents at the riverbed floor are fast enough to pick up sediment and move it all the time, or whether it slows down and can deposit there. That can help us understand the transport characteristics of contamination, but it can also tell us whether or not there are certain remedial alternatives that we could consider that lend themselves to a site where it's more depositional than erosional. And so one of the things that we'll do is we have a pretty good current flow model that was developed for this area, not just for this project, but also for some of the navigation work that's happened at the site. And so what we're going to do is go out and collect real current measurements, and the modeler said I shouldn't use the word validate, but use it anyways. To validate the model and fine tune the model, make sure that.
Calibrate.
Calibrate, yes, exactly. And just the photos on the left are just, it's to give you an idea of what the river bottom looks like. The top photo of those two photos is sand waves, and that's on the south side of Bradford Island, and that's where it's nice and sandy. When we were doing some passive sampling, you just stick the thing many feet into the bottom. And then the bottom photo is from the North Shore, and that's the rocky cobble area. And you're trying to put some passive samplers directly into the riverbed. You can actually hear the divers pounding on rebar with the hammer from the surface, just because it's so hard there. So it's just one of the challenges we'll have to work through. I think that's it for that. So that's the primary focus of what we're collecting in the river in the coming year or two. We are also doing some bathymetry, some high resolution bathymetry. Part of this is to help with design and feasibility study, but part of it is to look at, if we can look at the riverbed and see if there's areas where there are differences after the spillway open period compared to the spillway closed period, and see if the riverbed elevation is changing. Maybe that tells us something about where we have deposition and where we have erosion. And these surveys get down to sub-foot accuracy, so we can tell changes over time fairly well. You know, there's a limit to that, but that's one approach that we'll be using with our contractor. And this is a survey that was just done March. I think this is from March. We'll take another one in September after the spillway has been open. And then we'll take another one the following March, and then we'll use those three data sets.
So this was right before spill started.
This is right before
Spill started in April.
Yeah. All right, next slide. So those are things we're going to be doing in the river. We thought we'd talk a little bit about what kinds of work have we done since the RI came out in the last few years. It's now probably more like 6 to 7 years, I guess. And so some of this work has been up in the uplands, OU. Some of this has been in the river. We've done groundwater sampling. We're still we're getting in some final samples in that sampling effort, and we'll have that data coming out fairly soon. We did some soil sampling in the sandblast area at a portion of the sandblast area that was undersampled during the RI. Stormwater sampling, I'll talk a little bit more about those three on the next few slides. Also, there were some archaeological surveys. That was primarily looking to see if there were any tribal artifacts or archaeological points of archaeological importance. And that's information that helps us when we're trying to make sure we don't impact those during our work or during any remediation work. And then also some geotechnical investigations of the bulk slope area, and that's a portion of the island that is on the North Shore where materials were disposed of in the 50s to the 80s. And so that slope is somewhat erosional. So we're trying to figure out how to stabilize that slope. And then in the river, there was a tissue sampling effort along with some fish telemetry studies, and then a passive sampler study to try to understand where we might have source areas for PCBs. And I'll talk about those two in the next few slides. So all of this information, not just these studies here on this slide, but also the river OU investigations we're doing, will be part of upcoming what we are calling a supplemental remedial investigation. And so it's taking the existing remedial investigation that we have and then adding in this new information we have and publishing those findings in a final SRI report that would then support the evidence. Next slide. So groundwater sampling, we have groundwater wells that were used during the remedial investigation. They were left in place, and we were able to revive them, I guess. I'm not sure whether they're not a groundwater person. Was that? Recondition them. And so we were able to collect groundwater samples from each of those wells. And primarily those wells are located in the landfill area of concern, which is in the upper right-hand side of that picture of the island, and all those MWs, monitoring wells. On the right-hand side, those are all in the landfill area. And then in the left-hand side, that's the sandblast area. And so we're looking at groundwater samples taken from each of those areas. This is basically trying to look at whether groundwater concentrations are similar to what we saw 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. If they've gone down, if they've stayed the same, we're gone up. And we've looked at the full suite of analytes for our upland sites. So we've looked at metals, pesticides, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, petroleum products, polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which is one of our big things at our site, and then also volatile organic carbons, or VOCs. And some of this is related to solvents that were stored at the sandblast area, right around NW11 is where the chemical storage area was. And still is. Let's see. So these samples, we're just getting the data now. We've got some of the data where we have one more well that we sampled, MW10. We sampled that because of some a question in the data, and so we should be releasing it soon. Just one thing to point out is there's no drinking water supplies in this part of the island. This groundwater doesn't supply drinking water. So at least based on the RI, but based on risk assessments, groundwater was not considered a pathway for risk for the site. But we do have to consider the potential source to the river. So some of this work is to make sure that it's not a source to the river. Okay. Part of the sandblast area. So the sandblast area is that red shape, all that red shape map on the bottom. And a portion of the sandblast area, which is shown in the map with the colored polygons, was undersampled during the remedial investigation. It was sampled fairly well for lead, but not for other contaminants of concern. And this is an area of the sandblast area where sandblast grit from the building, the sandblast building, which is toward the left-hand side of that polygon photo, would blow across the site up to a tree forested hillside, which is represented by our study data. The other thing was that they used to take sandblast grit waste and pile it right around where the red, sort of orangey red polygon is DU2A, or sorry, 2B and 2A, both of those. And so we know that there's sandblast grit there. And so what we're trying to do is better understand the full suite of contaminants that might be present, and then also to see if we can develop a remedial strategy that addresses those areas where we know it's a problem, but doesn't reach too far up into the woods, and we don't have to deforest the mature forest, mature fir forest on that hillside slope. So DU7, DU6, those are up on the slope, and the conceptual site model was that most of the material that would have gone there would have been blown during the sandblast activities, the winds that come up the Columbia River. And we gradually see contamination as you go up slope gets less, so the concentrations get less, and it also becomes more superficial. It's just right on the top of the soil. So do we really need to remediate those areas and deforest them? If we do need to remediate them, can we do something that's a fairly less invasive procedure so that we can preserve the forest? So that's part of the goal of this study. Samples were collected not last summer, but the summer before, and we've, I believe that's in the administrative record actually. There's a data report for that data. And it looks, the data looks as we might expect it to based on that conceptual set model. So we see contamination in DU 2B, 2A, 3, which is that long orange one, DU 5, 4, which is a tiny little sliver that goes around the cement pad that's squared in the middle of the photo. So all of those are likely to need some type of remedial action, but DU 6 and 7 are likely not to. And so that helps us to manage that portion of our feasibility study and our remedial design. So I think that's that one. One of the unique things about the sandblast area is that it does have a couple of stormwater drains that go into the Columbia River, and there's a series of catch basins up in the sandblast area that drain to those two different outfalls. And so one of the things that we were doing is trying to look at what contamination might be coming into the river from the stormwater. And so there was a year-long sampling effort with 4 storms that were collected in 2019 and 2020. Those have been published, they're in the administrative record. And essentially, once there was a clean out done, so the other thing that kind of happened that coincided with this effort was a total clean out of all the lines, which hadn't been done in quite some time. And so once all that clean out had been completed, really what was coming out of the stormwater was primarily some copper and some PAHs at fairly low concentrations. One of the sources of copper was from a heating and cooling system that had some cooling water that would come down through a swale and go through these outfalls. And so one of the BMPs that was employed was to make that system, what's the word? Recirculating, so it didn't have wastewater. And so that source has been cut off completely and has reduced the volume of flow tremendously from those outfalls, and also the copper concentration we are presuming have gone down. We haven't measured them since. But so those 2 stormwater outfalls are, while they may have been historical sources to the river, they don't appear to be at this time. Let's see, the next slide. Tissue studies. So the other thing that we had done in 2020 and in 2022 was to do some tissue collections. You know, we've talked about the North Shore of Bradford Island as being one of our primary areas of interest because of the PCB concentrations there. However, the RI included only 3 samples from that area of fish. It was sampled relatively well for clams, and then also for crayfish in the past. And so part of this effort was to try to get an updated data set. It's been about 13 years since fish were collected. The other challenge with that previous data set was that the sampling occurred fairly a short duration after the dredge event in 2007, 2008. And what we've seen from other sites is that dredging can affect the body burden of fish for a certain amount of time. And so it was kind of in that window of time where we still had a generation of fish that could have been, and clams that could have been exposed to that suspended material from the dredging action. And then also, because of the fairly low sampling frequency of the site, it's awfully hard for us to look at the biota and what it's telling us about where our source areas may be because we have so few samples. So this was to try to make a more comprehensive effort at getting samples, not just from the North Shore of Bradford Island, but also from the Goose Island area, from Boat Rock, which is sort of in the middle of the river, that one little cluster of yellow stations, and then also the Washington side. And so we've collected samples in August, September, the fall of 2020. There's 80 smallmouth bass, 40 crayfish composites, and then a fairly comprehensive array of samples with clams. And clams are particularly useful at helping us understand where source areas might be because you're not moving around as much. And so we can pair that with sediment data or other types of data to try to understand where our source areas might be to the pipeline. So we had a fairly comprehensive sampling grid for claims. We also collected fish in the spring, and partly this was to say, well, if the fall fish are telling us something at some point after we look at the data, in the spring we have a different, possibly a different subpopulation of fish. We have different fish movements because now the spillway is open as opposed to being closed. So the fish are less likely to move across the river, but perhaps more up and down the river. And so we did a sampling effort that was very similar to the fall effort, but in the spring. And so we're still accumulating that data and trying to interpret that data and work with the states and EPA, trying to understand what it's telling us. And then the next slide. And then coupled with the fish study, with the smallmouth bass, we did some fish tagging and tracking in both efforts. The tracking data was collected from August to December for the fall fish. And then the spring fish was from March to August. So we almost have a year's worth of data that helps us understand fish movement in this area. And previous to this, there really wasn't any data at all. What we tried to do was the fish are tagged, and then what we can do is see when they go by one of the receivers. And so on the map that's on the upper right-hand side of the semicircle, those act like gates. So every time a fish goes through one of those, it's acting like a gate. It's passing through a gate, and you get a ping on the signal. And so then you can count that and tell whether the fish have been moving out of a certain area into another area of that forebay, and or whether they're leaving the forebay altogether to the upriver, and whether they're going down river of our site as well. This is work that's been done by USGS, and they're in the process of summarizing the spring data and publishing some of that. So that's coming up. For the most part, what we found, at least in the fall, is that the fish tended to stay close to where they were caught and released during that fall period. So if they were caught in the North Shore of Bradford Island, that's pretty much where they stayed. If they were caught over in Goose Island, they stayed pretty much at Goose Island, although there did seem to be some pattern between Goose Island and Boat Rock and coming back and forth there. We didn't see any movement of the Washington fish over to the north side of Bradford Island or in the other direction. So this is particularly helpful for us because in the original data set from the RI, there were some fish that were caught over in Goose Island that had elevated concentrations of PCBs. And one of the questions is, are they going to Bradford Island and getting that dose and then coming back over and hanging out at Goose Island? And is there much movement between those two different areas? And so hopefully this helps to address that question. I think that might be. Oh, one more. The last piece is some passive sampling. This is some sampling that was developed a while ago. Actually the idea came from Jeremy Black at US Fish and Wildlife Service and Jennifer Peterson at ODQ. And this is to take passive samplers, which is a sampler you can put out for a month, and it will average, it will absorb PCBs or other organic contaminants onto its surface over time. And it allows you to measure concentrations that are very low because you're accumulating them over a long period of time. These passive samplers, we try to do a passive sampler where we push the sampler into the sediment bed. So what I was talking about earlier, where you can't get anything in that bed. These were placed right at the surface, as close to the surface as possible. So it's trying to see if you have any kind of bioavailable PCBs in that water that's right at the sediment water interface. And if that just tells you something about where your potential source areas are. And we do think that we see that. We're starting to work with this data as well. We've been working with some technical issues related to the data. We're kind of past that, and now we're just trying to work with the data. And you can see this, some of the same suspects for our source areas that we've had all along are showing up, which is the eastern tip of Bradford Island, that dark red area on the upper right-hand side. And that's where one of the areas where material was disposed of from the landfill directly into the river. And then also in that hatched shape there is one of the old debris piles that was mapped. And then along the north shore of Bradford Island, you'll see another orange blob that is elevated concentrations of PCBs in this passive sampler. It's a little bit offshore and downslope of that other debris pile, the second debris pile to the left. And so that's perhaps an indication that there is some contamination that remains that's slightly offshore and downslope of where those debris piles were. So we'll hopefully use this data along with the clam data that we collected and the sediment data all together to try to use these multiple lines of evidence to understand the nature and extent of contamination out here and where and how we can remediate the site. So that's kind of that piece. I believe that's it. So all of this will get rolled up in these SRI reports, supplemental remedial investigation reports that I mentioned earlier, and hopefully synthesize in a way that maybe we start to really understand this. That's it.
And that would be made available to the public.
Yeah.
To review that SRI. Okay.
Are there any questions for Bill?
So, not necessarily available for review to the public, but the public will have access to it. Yes, sir, yes.
Probably something everybody already knows that all the transformers and other sources of PCBs and such been removed.
There was a removal action in 2002. There were actually two where the equipment was removed and cataloged. It was originally mapped using divers and also shoreline surveys during low river periods that draw the river down a little bit and survey the shorelines. So they tried to map it out fairly carefully and removed it during two different removal efforts and pulled up a lot of mass, a lot of stuff. And so the hope is that most of the equipment is coming. There's certainly the possibility that there could be something out there that wasn't mapped originally, but the hope is that we've gotten that, that we're trying to chase this PCB oil that's still in some.
So the equipment was removed in 2002, and then in 2007, Bill mentioned earlier, there was the dredging along the north shore of Bradford Island that removed contaminated sediment at that time. So two removal actions so far to try to address that contamination in the river. So a lot of this sampling that Bill has been discussing is after those two removal actions to see what's left, nature and extent, and what's going to be needed to remediate that area.
Yeah, and after the dredging, there was a comprehensive sampling effort that occurred in 2011. And there's still some high concentrations of PCBs in the sediment and in the tissues. So that's one of the reasons we're still working on it. Thank you.
So do you have a question from Jess Groves, one of your members? So Jess, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm curious what species of fish were tested?
Over the course of the project, smallmouth bass and sculpin. The more recent sampling that I was showing here that was done in 2020 and 2022 was smallmouth bass. And typically we look at resident fish. Hopefully we're looking at resident fish that have some association to the bottom. And sculpin are very good for that, and smallmouth bass are also good just because of what they eat. They tend to eat crayfish and clams in this area. But we typically don't, at this point, look at migratory fish like salmon, just because they're not spending that much time at the site, whereas a smallmouth bass or another fish that might spend most of their life at the site.
So might want to mention the fish advisory at this point, which is for resident fish only, not for salmon or steelhead, because of the reason Bill just mentioned. They're migratory and they don't stick around to pick up the contamination. So the fish advisory is for resident fish, like the bass and sturgeon.
They're just flagging there's a limit on the, right, even though it's not a resident fish in that area. Yeah.
That's the lamprey advisory.
Carl, I'm happy to ask your question for you, but if you want to unmute yourself, you're certainly welcome to ask it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, now I can't hear you too well, but that's my problem. Yeah, I was just curious how all this work will be done or will be coordinated with whatever work will be done by or for EPA as a result of their designating Bradford Island a Superfund site.
Well, I mean, it all kind of feeds into the, you know, basis of design for, you know, remedial actions, and it's all just kind of investigatory work right now. You know, we're really looking for the nature and extent of the contamination, what shape, you know, what form is it in, where is it at, where is it gone, and what are the pathways that it's entering into, you know, the biota, basically, at least for the in-river. So it depends on what it depends on what study, right? The passive sampling will give us an indication of where Napple is, if it is out there in the river, and, you know, the hotspot locations of it. And the flow monitoring will tell us, you know, the fate of the sediment, you know, basically where it's going to move around to. So all those are part of these lines of evidence that we gather in order to determine, you know, what our appropriate action should be. But there's other evidence to get too. You know, there's more sampling, there's you know, more sediment sampling and things like that, things that are more, you know, defined and quantitative, as opposed to, you know, some qualitative stuff. So it all kind of feeds into the investigation, the feasibility study, and the you know, proposed plan.
So Carl, this is Chris. Let me try to address the question maybe from a slightly different angle. Your question seemed to imply that EPA has a separate action going on, study and so forth, versus what the Corps is doing. And because of the listing of the site on the national priority list. And let me just explain that with the listing of the site, all that did was put EPA as the lead regulator on the site. The Corps is still the lead agency for the cleanup of Bradford Island. And the Corps is conducting the studies. And we do that by coordinating with the lead regulator, EPA, and the states of Oregon and Washington to get their feedback. But the Corps is the one responsible and conducting those studies and developing the remedial alternatives that will be written up in the feasibility study eventually, and ultimately will lead to a proposed plan with the recommended alternative, and then to a ROD. And that, what I've described, is the CERCLA process, which we've been following all along and we're still following. And so the only thing that changed was EPA is the lead regulator in that effort now, instead of the states, basically.
So I'm gonna have to push back a little bit on that.
Yeah.
The site getting listed did not only basically make EPA the lead regulator, it also put in place the CERCLA controls and the oversight that's necessary to ensure that the CERCLA process is being followed. It's not just, we're not just a reporting agency. CERCLA statute says that EPA has final decision-making authority on the remedy out there. So if there's a dispute, if you bring forth a plan that we don't agree with, then that goes to dispute, and it ultimately becomes the decision of the EPA administrator to decide what that remedy is going to be. So I wanted to clarify that
Sure.
because
Sure.
there's been a lot of talk about lead facility and what that actually means. But it's being construed in a way that is not consistent with circular. So I wanted to make that clear. I wanted to
Sure,
clarify
to
that.
be clear, we've been following CERCLA, and I appreciate your clarification that you're enforcing CERCLA, that's fine, that's what a regulator does. And it is a collaborative effort, I think, between EPA and the Corps. We are working with you. And hopefully when we get to the point of selecting the remedy, we will be on the same page and aligned. That's our goal, and I'm sure that's your goal too. We don't want to get to a point of dispute. I was trying to clarify for Mr. Merkel that EPA is not conducting their own studies. It's part of the effort, the collaborative effort we're endeavoring, and the Corps is conducting and paying for those studies.
So can you still hear me? What does that coordination or collaboration entail? Is there a devoted specified team at EPA that is meeting regularly with Corps staff and the Corps team doing the on-the-ground work? And I'm just curious how the process is playing out.
Yes, so this is Jackie Fraser, Program Manager. So yes, our technical team, our project team is meeting with the states to coordinate our efforts, collaborate our efforts on the project so that this is done the way it needs to get done. What we are doing on top of that, I was gonna wait for the opportunity later, but again, we're going through making sure that we are coordinating with stakeholders the way we, would like to for the project. So again, we're meeting with our regulators, we have the RAB established, and then the Corps is now going to be attending the coordination meetings that EPA is holding that also meets with states and tribes and other agencies. So that as we're going through the entire process, we are communicating, we are coordinating, we're collaborating, so this project gets completed successfully.
Okay. Thank you. And also, I guess related to that, since it is a Superfund site and is NPL listed, does that trigger in any way, the examination of natural resource damages? The appointment of a natural resource damages trustee council, any of those ramifications?
It's not necessarily through the circle process. Our main concern when it comes to natural resource destruction and habitat is basically what may be impaired or destroyed through the action that we take. If we were to remove some of the forest, we would want to replant that as an example. But also to create other habitats for fish spawning if we end up dredging up an area that may be used for those purposes. So we don't directly influence the Natural Resources Discovery or Destruction Acts, NERDAR, however you want to say it. But that's through a separate mechanism.
The one thing that might be worth mentioning, that slightly separate effort from the types of work that we're doing, is the APSDR study, and let's see.
That is statutory though. Once it is set up, once the site is listed on the NPL, TDR does do a human health risk assessment.
Yeah, and so that might be worth discussing at some RAB meeting. That's not something we do. That's something that APSDR works with the state.
Yeah.
Because state actually is the agency that implements the APSDR. There's a little bit of study that goes on, and then some analysis, and then they make recommendations regarding potential impacts to the community. And so that's something to be aware of.
We do have Jess, you have a question?
Yeah, guys, I just got off of a 4-year committee working with NOAA Fisheries, on the Columbia River Basin Task Force for salmon and endangered species and habitat. So I'm curious, is NOAA involved with any of these conversations? And I think I heard you say earlier that you're not as concerned about migratory fish, as you are the residential fish. But, there's a huge concern about the salmon population going downhill here for the whole Columbia River Basin.
Yeah, and one distinction I should probably make is that when we're looking at fish tissue concentrations and sampling fish or other animals for the work that we're doing under CERCLA, it's to help us define what areas need to be remediated and what the pathway is for the site. And so it's, let's see. So we typically look at resident fish because they represent the fish community and are considered to be the worst case scenario, have the most exposure to the site. So it's not to say that fish passing through may not be impacted by a site. I'm not going to say it's necessarily true for our site. The residence time, at least for some of the migrating fish, is fairly short, but for any site, migratory fish could potentially be exposed to a site, but they're not the worst case scenario, which is what we typically design to when we're trying to remediate a site. But hopefully I said that correctly. That's one of the reasons why we're the resident fish.
I could add a little bit. It's helpful. This is Jack, Portland District Office of Council. There is some interplay with the Endangered Species Act and CERCLA, specifically how the Corps will implement any remedial action that's selected jointly with EPA. The Corps of Engineers needs to ensure that that remedy, implementation of it, doesn't harm ESA listed fishes or adversely impact, their habitat. And so the Corps will be working closely with NIMS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that implementation remedy is good for ESA listed fish and their habitat. So there is some coordination further down the road. If anything in the interim were to occur, whether it's an interim remedial action or a removal action, another removal action, those also would be coordinated with NIMS and U.S. Fish to make sure that those interim actions would also not result in, take or harm to those ESA listed fish.
So, yeah, Kate definitely has a question, and I want to make sure we get to her. We did have one question from a member of the public online, but it's very relevant to the presentation. So if it's all right with the members, I'll ask that. So the question was the bathymetry survey done with high enough resolution to notice if additional equipment remained in the river?
Possibly. We haven't looked at it from that lens yet, but it's I don't know the exact resolution, but it's very high resolution survey, so it could probably get used for larger equipment. And we'll probably look at it through that lens, as well as looking at some of the other things like where to put certain instruments and how to remediate the sites.
Who asked that question?
That's a good question.
Laura Shara.
Laura. And Laura, just so you know, and I think you know this, that at the time they did the equipment removal in 2002 with the divers, they did magnetometer surveys to try to detect any metals that may be slightly buried. So it was a pretty thorough survey, as Bill mentioned, to make sure we did get all the equipment out. But that, if there might be equipment still there, if it is, it's probably buried and probably wouldn't show up in a bathymetric survey.
Yeah, it's a good step to walk through that.
And I do have a note. So for the RAB members, if you are interested in presentation or more information for the ATSDR health risk, Dan Crosby has offered to present. Thank you for that. I'm sure they will be taking you up on that at the appropriate time. So thank you, Dana. That's everyone from online.
What Dana who?
Crosby from OHA.
Kate, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I just had a more general question. in terms of, maybe kind of two parts, in terms of how you decide the parameters of your sediment sampling. Because I know we have this kind of map for the fish advisory. I don't know if we know exactly where the boundaries are for what's safe. And so do you kind of continue testing until the levels drop? And that's kind of how you draw a boundary? And then the second part of that question is, I know you listed some of the different contaminants that you test for, both in, you know, whether it's groundwater, sediment, or fish tissue. And is there a list of the specific contaminants that are included in this study? Because I imagine, you know, when we think about testing sediments, I imagine you're testing for a list of particular contaminants rather than assessing the entirety of the sediment sample, or are you looking at the?
Yeah, it depends on the phase of the study. We typically start with a really broad list, and then as we investigate the site, we go through different phases under CERCLA with a, you know, an initial investigation, which is fairly low resolution, and gradually get to high resolution sampling. We'll refine that list, but we're still working with a fairly broad list of contaminants. We have, in particular for the river, we know we have a subset of pesticides that are showing up occasionally in tissues and in fish. The linkage between sediment and fish is not as obvious as it has been for PCBs. PCBs, obviously, mercury, we're looking at other metals as well. Mercury is systemic in the Columbia River, as you know, and so we're trying to understand that data right now. It kind of looks like this mercury signal in the tissues at the site are indicate that it's systemic. It's not related to maybe our site or a source, but it's more systemic. PCBs obviously is much more site oriented. But we're looking at a fairly broad list. We have PAHs, departments that we look at, a suite of metals, and we'll probably preserve that list through this next investigation of the sediments as well. As far as how far away to look, partly we'll probably have a certain resolution of sampling, but we'll also have some samples that are further out that help us determine to make sure we bound it. And one of the reasons for bounding the contamination along that north slope is that if the remedy happens to be a cap, you want to make sure your cap has gone far enough to contain it and that it's not slipping out from the needs. So that's the next phase that we'll be working with the states and with EPA on is what does that sample design look like, and making sure that we're getting far enough out that we can find the boundary of the contamination.
So you might wonder why we didn't do this previously, this extensive sampling. And, you know, this has been in the works for many years, as you all know. And the thinking early on was you just sample enough so you have enough information to develop your remedial alternatives for your feasibility study. And then you do the type of sampling you do now. You would do that during the design phase, and you develop the nature, extent, and footprint of the actual cap or whatever the remediation is. And so that has changed. The thinking now is they want that information sooner than later. So that's why we're going back and filling a lot of those data gaps now that we were going to fill during the next phase, during the design phase, but it's been determined we need to do that now during the remedial investigation feasibility phase. So that's why we're going back and filling in the data gaps we have and producing a supplemental RI.
Yeah, just to clarify that a little bit further, that there's always different opinions on where some of that data should be collected, but as a whole, we have determined that we do not have enough to determine nature and extent and to fully evaluate all of the aspects of alternatives that we need to decide that alternative. And that's why we're going back.
We've got one more question, I think, from Carl. This question is, has there been any testing for PFAS, PFOS, or is it primarily PCBs?
Primarily PCBs. We are, so as part of Army's policy, Department of Defense policy is most installations are looking at the potential use for PFAS at their site. We're undergoing that same thing. So the first step is to see if they were even used at the site. And so I'm actually working on that right now. And so we look at the historic fire suppression systems throughout the facility and the potential for PFAS to be there. And then we'll also look at some of the materials and the coatings that we use to see if it's possible that PFAS was used in any of the materials that would be at the site. And so we have not sampled for it, but from it doesn't appear that we need to, but we're still in the process of trying to understand that.
Yeah, for the fire suppressant out there, I wouldn't imagine that you would be using AFFF out there. It'd be like halon or something, right?
Yeah, they didn't use any PFAS. They used carbon dioxide for the powerhouses, and then water and halon for other different buildings.
Yeah, the AFFF or aqueous film, film forming fluid is generally for fuel fires. You'll see it a lot at airports and military Air Force bases and things like that. But with electrical fire, you don't really want to spread liquid all around. So generally it's like halon or something that just take the oxygen out of the area. So PFAS isn't that much of a concern for us. Unless there were fire training pits, which we would see at military installations, but not out here. So
Great.
There aren't any other questions from the members. I do want to make sure I get this comment in here because it was related to the discussion we were having about EPA's role, USACE's role. So the comment was, it looks like there are options, quote, technical assistance refers to the provision of services focused on increasing community understanding of the science, regulations, and policy related to environmental issues and EPA actions. And this looks like it comes straight off of EPA's website and their guidance for tax. So just need to make sure you heard that.
I can give a little update on the Columbia River Keepers has put in for a tag grant. I believe it's going to be next week or the week after that's going to get published in the newspaper, and around that time we'll be inviting other parties to jump onto the tag grant and see if we can get some more participation. So
Tag was technical assistance grant.
grant, correct, yeah. And not to be confused with, there's some talk about the previous tag, which was a technical advisory group, I think it was called, but under EPA circular it's a tag is a technical assistance grant, yeah. So it's really for the RAB and RAB members to hire a professional to review these documents that are coming through, like a proposed.
I was going to ask that question. And
Yeah.
I wasn't quite sure where to fit that in, but that's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we had any funds to bring in a third party to verify all this stuff.
Yeah, that's absolutely
Okay.
what it's for. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any say in like who that third party is, or is that, how's that?
Oh, yeah, that's, yeah, we don't tell you who to hire.
Okay.
So, yeah. It's really just we're working with, we're trying to get those list of documents that would come out, the relative level of effort that's going to be needed for that, and then you can project out how much a senior engineer or something like that might require for that. So, but we don't decide who you hire on, so.
That's everything. So thus far on mine. So, oh, of course, one more. Is the tag grant application specific to the Bradford Island RAB?
Next week, 5/17 is what I'm being told. Yes, it is. It's specific to Bradford Island, and it's just specific to this restoration advisory board.
Everything online.
Okay,
Co-chairs.
So now we just move the public comment.
Unless.
Go ahead, Kate.
I believe we added to the agenda last week to discuss further the delay with the federal facility agreement and also the connection with tribal engagement. And since our last meeting, the Confederated Tribes and Bands of Yakama Nation have put out a press release and a notice of intent to sue the federal government for lack of engagement with Yakama Nation. And so I sent those documents ahead of time, but I'd like those to be submitted to the notes for public record, so that they can be available for folks to have as a reference. But I think that's place, I'm not sure how that agenda item got dropped from this agenda, because I confirmed between meetings and email that it was gonna be on the agenda. So I'm not sure why it didn't make it on, but the last meeting we discussed, yeah, you remember, but I think that's why we were gonna talk further about those two issues.
Okay, so do we want to get into that federal facilities?
That's being negotiated by other people at a different level. That's not the purpose of the RAB, but Jeff, do you?
Sure. Yeah, with the RAP's permission to add this to the agenda officially, I can answer, Kate, provide an update if that's what you'd like.
Yeah, and just to clarify, this was something we discussed last meeting that would be added to the agenda, so I'm not bringing this as a new item now.
As a regular item, every meeting?
No, for this meeting to
Oh,
discuss.
that's right.
Yeah, so it was, I'm not sure why I didn't make it on the agenda, but I think I emailed to Dan in the meantime and spoke to him about making sure that it was on the agenda. So, yeah,
Kate,
I'd love to.
yeah, this is Jeff Mattson, Portland District Office of Council. I can probably tackle some of your questions. I'm sorry that was left off the agenda.
Yeah, no
You're
worries.
right. We agreed to add it to the agenda, so I apologize for that oversight. I can speak a little bit to the progress of the FFA negotiations. To your point, they have bogged down over what changes are appropriate to this model, federal facility agreement between DoD and Army, DoD and EPA. And I think we have some progress. I can't go into the specific, the court considers it confidential. However, I think we're a lot closer based on some of my discussions with my counterpart for Region 10 recently at the joint nation-to-nation meeting with the Yakama Nation. So I remain hopeful that we can reach agreement this year at some point. In fact, it is both agencies' intent, the lead regulator and the lead agency, to meet this month. There are potential dates, I think the 16th and 17th of May and the 24th and 25th of May. And my lead negotiator, if you will, is a headquarters attorney based out of Omaha, works for our chief counsel's office. And she's kind of trying to schedule that with the assistance of our program manager right now. So hopefully we might have more to report at the next RAB meeting if we can come together a little bit closer. As Kate, you probably know, I can't speak to the allegations or the claims in Yakama Nation's notice of intent to sue under CERCLA citizen supervision. But, in a nutshell, of course, and this is, public record, they're unhappy with the delay. CERCLA Section 120 requires that an FFA agreement be in place by a certain amount of time. I don't know if there are examples of FFAs that have been put in place that time. They typically take a little bit longer for DoD and the military services to negotiate them than the time period that lists in the statute. But it is a requirement in the statute. Other allegations are both technical and kind of legal. I don't want to speak for the Yakama Nation. If there's someone on the line that would like to speak to their claims, they can do so. I think that regarding the Yakama Nation's involvement, we'd love to have both tribal members and representatives from the Yakama Nation Fisheries Department as a part of these tag meetings, RAB meetings now. And the Corps of Engineers, I know along with EPA, is willing and able and interested to meet separately with the Yakama Nation and other interested tribes. There's another mechanism for tribal involvement that's currently being negotiated echelons above me at Army Office of General Counsel. that might be amenable to the tribe. Still kind of a do out there. Again, maybe we'll have more to report at the next RAB meeting, but hopefully that provides you a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of where we are.
Thank you. One of the things that I brought up with Dan, when we had a phone call after the last meeting was, it would be super helpful to understand, because I know last time we talked about, you know, the desire for tribal engagement being part of the delay, and it would be helpful to understand why Yakama Nation was excluded from the government team to begin with, whether that is somewhere actually in regulatory language. Was that a decision made by someone along the line? And if so, can we revisit that? That would be helpful because I'm still not clear on who is making a decision, and Yakama Nation can speak for themselves, but they are recognized as a sovereign government, and it's not clear to me why they're not part of the government team. So I think, you know, I share the concern for the timing of the FFA because we had initially a 1-year deadline for a promise to complete the FFA, which, you know, is going to drive a lot of, I think, the momentum on the cleanup. And, you know, I understand how things get bogged down, but I think for like the public communication and transparency, it's difficult to have that 1-year deadline pass and then say, we're nowhere close, we don't have a timeline, and it's confidential. I think that, you know, if we want to build some public trust in the process, I think that it's helpful to be as transparent as we can be without breaching confidentiality. But I think, you know, we have an actual public health emergency that's happening. There's exposures happening on a daily basis, and I think we should try to, you know, bring some of that urgency to this issue. I think is important.
And as Jeff said, you know, there's discussions happening well above our level, but at least at my level, again, as I indicated earlier, EPA has invited us to attend meetings with the states and the tribes to be able to coordinate technical efforts on Bradford and be able to provide updates specifically to them, and we will be attending those meetings that happen monthly. So that's our immediate due out that is now completed on the calendar.
And Kate, you know, because there's kind of a lingering issue about the technical advisory group and why the Corps disbanded it, I can answer that question to try to clear up, at least from the Corps' view, why we did that, if that's helpful for the RAB members.
I think it'd be helpful.
Sure. So kind of as Rich mentioned, there's official technical assistance grants, which is definitely its own thing. And then there's what became known as the technical advisory group. And it truly was an advisory group. It started out as a product of what we're doing here, community involvement, public involvement. I think through the process of attrition, it kind of whittled down to usual suspects, regulators, resource agencies, tribal representatives of tribal governments. We had representatives from the Nez Perce, Grand Ronde, other tribes, and it kind of became more focused, and ultimately became a body that the Corps of Engineers looked to for advice and recommendations. There's notes going back, you know, years and years about the Corps of Engineers trying to satisfy TAG members and the TAG as kind of a collective bodies, concerns with sampling plans, for example. And we took a hard look at that technical advisory group and just recognized that, number one, it was no longer serving its original public involvement, kind of open and transparent purposes. And then number two, and this is kind of a legal thing, and I think EPA has a different view, but we believe that as an advisory committee that the Corps of Engineers was going to, for advice and recommendations, consensus advice and recommendations, it implicated a statute or a law called the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And when you have an advisory committee that's providing consensus recommendations, not open to the public, et cetera, there's actually a protocol and a process and procedure that you have to go through under FACTA. It's really onerous. Long story short, it's not that the TAG is prohibited by FACTA. It's more that the lead agency needs to make sure it can comply with FACTA. For example, you guys are probably recognize Hanford Reservation and Department of Energy. Department of Energy at the national level has site-specific advisory boards. And those are actually FACA compliant and, site advisory boards. And then at the sites, like Hanford, you have a site-specific advisory board. It's kind of similar to what we had as the TAG, but whereas Department of Energy's site-specific advisory boards are FACA compliant, ours basically wasn't. And so we kind of, on balance, do we want to make a FACA compliant TAG, or do we kind of want to course correct and get back to our public involvement, community involvement efforts? And we kind of landed on the other side, that this is more appropriate, acknowledging that we need to continue meeting on a technical level with the regulators, resource agencies when it's appropriate, other sovereigns as we can, once we get direction from DoD. But hopefully that gives you, it lays it all out on the table. We're not trying to hide any reasons why the TAG was disbanded, but it was really kind of legal reasons.
I think it's safe to say we've kind of moved into our comment section of the agenda. And Laura, I want to make sure, I know you had your hand up during that entire thing. So if you want to make your comment, please go ahead.
Sure, yeah, this is Laura Shira with Yakima Nation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I work for Yakima Nation Fisheries, and the question was asked earlier, on what basis did Yakima Nation file the notice of intent to sue the Corps? And it did have to do with the FFA, Federal Facility Agreement delays. There were technical reasons for such as not properly investigating the nature and extent of the site, not following CERCLA. And there were legal reasons, including the exclusion of Yakima Nation and other tribes for that matter, from the government tribe. The decision that we're seeing out of the Corps is unprecedented. It's not the same FACA interpretation from any other federal branch or agency. We work really well with EPA on technical advisory groups, or actually they're called technical coordination teams in that setting. We work really well with Forest Service, with NOAA, with US Fish and Wildlife Service. So this interpretation goes completely against CERCLA, against the Constitution, against treaty rights. The Constitution recognizes treaties as supreme law of the land. CERCLA puts tribes on the same level as a state. What the Corps is doing is saying those don't apply. Tribes aren't sovereign nations. Tribes are the same as a single citizen. And so I can't tell you how riled tribal members and tribal leadership get when they hear this disregard for constitutional law, for CERCLA law, and for tribal sovereign rights. And tribal fishers are the most exposed to this contamination on the river. And so to not allow tribal sovereign nations to have a voice in this process at the government team level is extraordinary. Thank you.
So yeah, as the next step, it would be, I think, helpful to understand more about who's making that decision. Is it explicitly not, it just seems like if the shared goal that we all have is to reduce harm and get to the business of cleaning up, that, efforts for inclusion and not, being exclusive to the point of getting involved in lawsuits would be beneficial to our goal of focusing on cleanup. So it'd be really helpful as, I don't know if others share this opinion, but as a ground member, I think it would be helpful to understand why we've gotten to this point. And it seems like that, I bring that up because it seems like that's part of the delay on the FFA. And if that's what we're waiting on to move forward with cleanup, it seems like a relevant issue to kind of try to understand if there's something we can do to make some changes that allow us to move forward together.
Kate, if you like, I can speak to maybe some of your concerns. Yeah, I recognize Laura and the Yakima Nation's views expressed in the notice of intent. The decision maker, the agency official that approves and signs the federal facility agreement, and yeah, as we've talked about, and I apologize for getting too into the weeds if that's where I go. But the federal facility agreement, Congress intended for it to be the governing agreement, interagency agreement at NPL sites between the and and the agency official that's responsible for approving and signing that is not out here at the Pacific Northwest. It's Mr. Michael Connor. He's the Assistant Secretary of the Army for the Corps' Civil Works Program. And until such time as he delegates his authority to approve and sign that federal facility agreement on behalf of Army and the Corps, that's the decision level. The FFA that Mr. Connor signs has to be acceptable to each of the military services. And so when we talk about creating and carving out a role for the Yakima Nation or other interested tribes in this cleanup, it implicates a federal facility agreement that would change and would look different for each of those military departments going forward. And so that's the sensitivity from the kind of Army and DoD levels, that what we're trying to accomplish with Bradford Island, it could very well be precedent setting for all of DoD, hence such close scrutiny and sensitivity to it at the Pentagon in DC.
Thank you for that. And I don't want to occupy too much of the time, but I guess I'm not totally clear on what you mean when you say if Yakima were included in engagement in the FFA, that it would look different. Because I think maybe I'm interested in how would it look different.
I think you mean their engagement codified in the FFA, right?
Correct.
Right, because there's been a long discussion and some miscommunication that Yakima Nation wanted to be part of the FFA and part of like a signatory to the federal facility agreement. That's not the case.
Right.
But to have their work and the works of other tribal members codified in the federal facility agreement. And that's the conversations that are having in DC right now, honestly, this week, next week. And it's been going on.
No, I agree with Rich. Right now, there's this model, it's called the Fort Eustis model. And Kate, I can provide that model if it hasn't been shared with the RAB members. And it was kind of apples to oranges to what we have going on out here at Bradford Island. It's over 10 years old.
13, something like that.
13 years old. It's a snapshot in time that DoD, Office of General Counsel, and EPA, OECA had agreed to, and it's completely silent on tribal involvement. And so not just the fact that the tribe doesn't want to be a party, but how we speak to any separate mechanism for tribal involvement that's referenced in the FFA, it would kind of disturb this old model that EPA and DoD have used over time. And that's the kind of change that DoD is a bit apprehensive of.
Jeff, how long did it take to get that model agreement for you?
Oh goodness, years and years and years. Where she might
But to get the FFA signed, or to get it, or to get the agreement that it would be the model language?
I guess both. Well, I'm more interested in, the model.
There was a previous model to Fort Eustis, and based on extensive negotiations across years to get to this next version of the Fort Eustis model, it took years and years. And so I acknowledge how dated it is. I acknowledge that there are different site-specific considerations at Fort Eustis in Virginia.
I'm not sure.
On the East Coast versus what's happening here in the significant tribal involvement, but acknowledging a robust role for the Yakima Nation and other interested tribes in meetings and other maybe involvement vehicles. A memorandum of understanding is kind of being discussed, I think. that is definitely a new development that the Fort Eustis model wasn't really intended to kind of cover.
And, there are rooms for these things to be updated, right? The Fort Eustis model has submission of documents in paper form, in triplicate or double or in triplicate or something like that. When we all, we can all take them in electronic forms now, so there is room for those things to be updated. But this is why we really are encouraging coming together either next week or on the 24th and 25th to really hammer out those details. And, we think, EPA thinks that most of the federal facility agreement, we think is workable, as we can agree to, very large parts of it. Maybe some minute details here and there, some language issues or something like that. But really working out the tribal involvement and how that looks, not only, going forward through, a memorandum of understanding or something like that, but if that gets codified into the FFA and how that works out, that's one of our primary goals for a meeting with the Corps and with the states next week.
They could be
Hopefully next
separate,
week,
wouldn't
I should
they?
say.
You'd have the FFA, then you have the MOU. The MOU would become part of the FFA, would it?
No, Chris, if there was a memorandum of understanding between the Corps and an interested tribe like the Yakama Nation, it would be separate from the FFA, but it would be expressly called out and acknowledged by the FFA. We want to capture that in the FFA. And then the devil's in the details. We need to make sure that any process, any separate process, doesn't conflict with the terms and conditions of the FFA. I think that's the art that folks well above me are trying to suss out whether that's going to be an acceptable path for the Yakama Nation or other interested tribes.
Okay. Anything else on that? Will we still in public comment? Is there anybody else that has any comments?
So we do have one from Laura related to the Fort Eustis. She said Fort Eustis site didn't have any tribes engaged, which is likely why it was silent on tribal involvement, which sounds like Jack confirmed. So thank you, Laura. Is there anyone else online who would like to make a public comment? No. Not seeing anyone.
I have one question.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, an additional question, hopefully less charge, but I appreciate the information on the work that's been done so far and that you're working on now and what you anticipate in the future. That was a lot to contemplate, and I wonder if you have information or estimates as to the timing, the duration, how long that further work will take. Do you have a timetable developed for when the various projects will be done and completed? I just wonder if you're looking at, I know weather is going to be a factor, so anything would be an estimate, but wondering whether you're looking at 2 years, 5 years, 6 or 8 years, anything like that. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing is, in general, I think the uplands will move a little faster than the river, just given the nature of the work and where we are and understanding at least the portions of the site that we've been working on. If I could,
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, so I think, as Rich was saying, that when we meet this month and really kind of hash out some of these big items, I think we can get at least what's gonna be in the site management plan and kind of overview. I think we can start providing that, and then just know that we'll continue to refine it. There's gonna be some things once we get to kind of a trigger point that schedule can, be updated and we can continue. But I'm hoping if we meet this month as we are planning and committing to, hopefully the next RAB, we can at least provide a high level on the schedule and explain some of that rationale.
Yeah, and as Jacqueline mentioned, part of the federal facility agreement is the site management plan, which is a living document that maps out the schedule for work to be done out there and also lays the framework for other investigations that might pop up and things like that, you know. And it's negotiation, you know. We at EPA tend to have a more aggressive schedule because we really want to get out there quickly. We want to, you know, do everything, but, you know, we understand that there can be delays and there can be some times, you know, issues there along with contractors and the window of work that can be done out there whenever the spillway is closed or whether it's supposed to be open. So, and funding, you're right. So it's all part of the negotiation.
Yeah, we
right?
have our own internal processes that we have to go through before we can start releasing those documents, and then we can kind of go into it. You know, and it's a schedule that we'll continue to try to pull to the left, expedite where we can, but there'll be a few things that, again, we can discuss during the update with why we have to assume the schedule at this point, and then once we get to a certain point, okay, now we'll be able to do a better update, maybe get something that's more realistic versus a little more conservative.
So the short answer to your question, Carl, is no, we don't have a schedule yet to tell you, but soon we will have a schedule.
Yes.
And we are working toward doing some sampling next year sometime.
All right, thank you.
There's no one else online. Okay, make a comment.
Any other comments from the room, from online? Going once, going twice, we're coming up on 7 o'clock. I think it's time to adjourn our meeting. Are you okay with that, Mr. Co-Chair?
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
Great.
so can we get a motion to adjourn?
Before we adjourn, are there any other agenda items that are wanted on the next RAB meeting agenda, so we don't lose track of that?
Additions.
Future, yeah, we're gonna have this standard agenda with the roll call and minutes approval, old business, new business, and we'll provide project updates as we have them. So that would be like a standard agenda, but there's a specific topic. I heard that Dana offered to present. Are you interested in hearing about the public health assessment?
Yeah.
That they're involved with, so we can put that on the agenda for next time. Dana, are you okay with that?
No, right, and any agenda items, you know, we can put them on and then we would look to see when it was appropriate for them to present. It may not be the next month, but we would look to make sure that those.
I'm just asking her if she's willing.
Right, yeah, just those topics will get covered at some point, so I just wanna put expectations.
Yeah,
I think
our
go ahead.
program is ready and willing whenever you'd like us to come present. And that can be on the human health risk assessment, or it can be on the fish advisory, or it can be on both.
Thank you, Dana. We'll let you know, okay?
And for the, sorry, Rich, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, by that time, EPA is gonna have an update on the technical assistance grant, so if we could put that on the agenda, that'd be great.
And then the other one I heard was the FFA, maybe history to how we got, at least from Kate, or how you got from point A to point B, and any updates, it sounds like, was the other one I heard.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a, you know, as Jack said, maybe we'll have an update on a high level schedule that comes out of our FFA negotiations, or maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think until the FFA is completed, it'd be a good idea to have that as a standing agenda item so that we can just check in on it every meeting. See if there's any updates.
Heck yeah, hold our feet to the fire, that's great. That's what this whole board is for.
So I just want to bring to the attention of the RAB members that the next scheduled meeting is June 8th. Now that's a Thursday and there is a conflict with this space on June 8th. Is that
Correct. I can't read emails. I thought it's a Tuesday, when it's a Thursday. The city planning commission is meeting that Thursday, but that Tuesday, the 6th, is wide open.
So I would strongly recommend an email dialogue about the availability of June 6th for our existing RAB members and their availability, so that we can then get the notice out to the public that it would be a shift of those dates. And if that doesn't work, then proposing alternate dates.
My bad.
No worries.
Anything besides that? Nothing?
Well, it sounds like we're probably gonna have to have a discussion about NERDA at some point, but I think we could probably hold off on that until we're a little bit further along. Here, so, but yeah, and then when we can, we'll jump into that as much as I don't want to. But we will.
Okay. So did I get a motion to adjourn?
I'll motion to adjourn.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you, Bill. Good presentation.